Under cold Appalachian skies, the story begins in late spring of 2011 when a decorated military veteran named Daniel Mercer set out alone on a stretch of the Appalachian Trail between Virginia and Tennessee. He carried with him standard hiking gear, a small journal, and according to family, a sense that the mountains might offer him clarity after years of deployments overseas. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Trail registers show his signature at shelters along the route. A ranger's report from May 14th notes a brief encounter with him near Damascus, Virginia, describing him as quiet, polite, but focused, as though he was walking with purpose beyond leisure. But less than a week later, his name vanishes from all records. Fellow hikers who should have crossed paths with him recall nothing. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy received no confirmed sightings past mile marker 462. For his family, the silence was immediate and unexplained. When Mercer's absence was reported, the National Park Service initiated what would become one of the more extensive searches in that section of the trail. Helicopters scanned dense canopies. Thermal imaging picked up deer and bears, but no human signature. Ground crews, often veterans themselves, combed ravines and shelters. Teams marked trees with orange tape, mapping grid after grid, but nothing turned up. A forensic canine unit flown in from North Carolina alerted twice near a stream bed, but heavy rainfall made scent tracking unreliable. Within 10 days, the official search was scaled back. The file notes, stamped in bold with "Subject not located," revealed the abrupt closure of effort despite lingering questions. His family pressed for answers, hiring private trackers and contacting the FBI field office in Roanoke, claiming Mercer's military background might make his case different from typical hiker disappearances. What stood out was his last phone record. A brief call pinged off a rural tower, an incomplete message to his brother. The words were distorted, but two phrases were legible: "Not alone" and "moving fast." Analysts wrote it off as poor reception, the sort of garble common in the mountains. But for investigators who later revisited the case, that recording became the first suggestion that Mercer believed someone or something was following him. The official explanation leaned on wilderness hazards. Black bears are known to track humans when food is scarce, and the Appalachian Trail has claimed lives through falls, exposure, and hypothermia. In one internal ranger memo, it was suggested Mercer may have miscalculated weather conditions, slipped into a gorge, and been carried off by spring floods. Another theory centered on human threat. Transient camps along the trail had drawn occasional reports of theft and violence. Yet in Mercer's case, there was no sign of robbery, no discarded gear, no trace at all. The case might have faded into the long list of unresolved trail disappearances had it not been for a discovery 6 years later. In October 2017, hunters in the Cherokee National Forest stumbled upon a weathered rucksack lodged beneath roots, half exposed by erosion. Inside, preserved by layers of wax-sealed plastic, was a small notebook. The cover bore Mercer's initials. Its pages were water-damaged, some smeared beyond recognition, but others remained legible. What investigators read unsettled them. The early entries resembled a travel log: miles walked, weather, brief sketches of wildlife. But by the third week, the tone shifted. Mercer described shadows moving parallel on ridge lines, and the sound of footsteps when none should be there. He wrote of cairns, small piles of stones that appeared overnight along his route, some arranged in precise triangles, others in circles near shelters. On May 15th, his last dated entry, he scribbled, "If this is found, know I tried to turn back. It does not stop following. It knows the trail better than I do." The notebook was sent to FBI labs in Quantico. Forensic analysts confirmed the handwriting as Mercer's. Soil and fungal samples on the pages matched the section of trail where he was last seen, narrowing his disappearance zone to within 20 miles of Damascus. Yet the journal raised more questions than it answered. Officials released only select excerpts to the family, withholding large portions under the justification of ongoing investigation. Freedom of Information Act requests yielded heavily redacted documents, entire paragraphs blacked out. Independent researchers, including former rangers and local historians, began connecting Mercer's case to older Appalachian folklore. The Cherokee people spoke of Tsul Kalu, a shadowy figure said to stalk hunters in the Smokies. Civilian hikers over the decades had reported eerie patterns of rock formations, unexplained noises, and the sensation of being watched, though such accounts rarely made it into official reports. What distinguished Mercer's journal was its systematic detail. Each entry included times, coordinates, and precise sketches of cairns and symbols. This was not folklore, it was field notes from a soldier trained in observation. Witness testimony collected in 2018 added another layer. 2 hikers reported seeing a man resembling Mercer on May 16th, a day after his supposed disappearance. He was described as disheveled, without a pack, moving quickly off-trail toward an old fire road. When questioned, the hikers admitted their memory was uncertain, blurred by years passing, but their statement aligned with Mercer's final entry. He had tried to turn back. Whether he succeeded remains unknown. By the time the journal surfaced, speculation outpaced official narrative. Some claimed Mercer encountered illegal activity drug runners or poachers who forced him to disappear. Others believed his writings hinted at psychological strain, perhaps the resurfacing of trauma from his deployments. Yet those who knew him insisted he was stable, disciplined, and not prone to hallucination. His brother told reporters, "If Daniel wrote he was being followed, then he was." The final FBI memo on record, dated 2019, closes with the phrase, "No further investigative leads at this time." But silence persists around the withheld pages, the ones investigators refuse to release. Independent experts speculate they contained sketches or descriptions inconsistent with conventional explanations, details officials feared might fuel public panic or conspiracy. What remains today is a haunting outline. A soldier walks into the Appalachians seeking peace, vanishes without a trace, and years later, his own words resurface testimony to something that watched, tracked, and perhaps claimed him. No body was ever recovered. No definitive evidence of foul play was proven. Just a journal, damp with age, whispering from the margins of the forest. The question lingers, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What really happened out there on the Appalachian Trail when Daniel Mercer disappeared into the woods, leaving behind only the words, "It does not stop following"? The first hours after Mercer's disappearance were treated as routine, the kind of incident rangers had seen before: an overdue hiker, a family anxious for updates, a trail too vast to cover in a single day. The official call came in on May 19, 2011, when Mercer failed to meet a scheduled check-in with his brother. His last confirmed signature in the Iron Mountain shelter log stood dated May 14th in clean block letters. After that, the line of documentation stopped. Rangers initiated a standard hiker verification sweep, calling ahead to shelters in nearby trail towns. None reported his arrival. By May 20th, the matter escalated to a full-scale search. Dispatch logs from that week reveal a rapid mobilization. Unit 12 commencing sweep, Sector C6, weather light rain, visibility poor. K-9 team deployed, East Ridge, no trackable scent beyond stream bed. The reports read as clinical, yet they reveal the frustration of crews searching terrain that seemed to erase all traces of him. Helicopter units flying from Johnson City scanned the valleys with thermal sensors, logging numerous animal heat signatures but no human outline. Volunteers organized under the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, many of them veterans who felt a kinship with Mercer, joined ground teams. They mapped grids, flagged trees, and combed ravines. Not a single piece of gear surfaced. No tent, no boot print, not even food wrappers. By May 24th, after 5 days of concentrated effort, the National Park Service drafted its first official summary. Subject presumed lost in wilderness. Environmental conditions consistent with accidental fall or exposure. That phrase would be repeated in subsequent memos, though it satisfied no one close to the case. His family pressed harder, insisting that Mercer had been trained to survive worse conditions overseas, that he would not have wandered off-trail without a purpose. The FBI entered the file quietly, requesting copies of the dispatch logs and K-9 team reports. Their involvement was noted in a single line. Federal request special circumstances. Witness accounts began to emerge. A pair of hikers, interviewed by park police, recalled seeing a lone man on May 15th moving quickly along a side path near Backbone Rock. They said he looked tired, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, but carried no pack. When shown a photograph of Mercer, they hesitated, then said it could have been him. The timing was significant after his final shelter entry, suggesting he was alive at least one day longer than official timelines assumed. The account was filed, then quietly downplayed. At the same time, rangers documented unusual findings near Sector D3, several cairns of stacked stones, freshly arranged at trail junctions. Photographs in the archive show them aligned in neat triangles, too deliberate to be random, too recent to be old markers. One ranger note, never included in the public summary, reads, "Pattern of construction, not consistent with known hiker practice, possible signal, possible misdirection." No follow-up was ever recorded. The search effort extended into early June before being scaled back. Families of missing hikers often cling to the hope that scaling back does not mean giving up, but in Mercer's case, the shift was abrupt. Helicopters stopped flying. Volunteers were told to stand down. The final Park Service report closed with the line, "Subject not located, probability of survival beyond 14 days minimal." For many, it seemed like the end of the case, but behind the closed doors of ranger stations and field offices, unease lingered. One ranger, speaking years later on Background, said, "We didn't just lose him. It was like the trail erased him. No trace, no gear, no body. That doesn't happen unless something is keeping it from being found." His words were never entered into official documentation, but they echo through the silence of those early reports, a silence that became heavier with every day Mercer remained missing. In the weeks that followed the suspension of the official search, Mercer's disappearance began to transform from a routine missing person case into something more unsettling. His family refused to accept the Park Service's conclusion. They contacted independent trackers, some of them former military colleagues of Mercer, who insisted that a man with his training would have left behind signs, broken branches, footprints, scraps of gear, if he had succumbed to the wilderness. None of that appeared. Private searchers revisited areas already combed, focusing on ridges and hollows that the initial grid may have overlooked. One tracker's field notes described finding impressions in the soil consistent with pacing near a secluded campsite, along with faint markings on trees. He photographed the site, but the images were later deemed inconclusive. Family members also pressed for greater federal involvement. The FBI officially downplayed its role, stating only that it had offered consultative support. Yet internal correspondence later leaked suggested something else. A request was made for aerial reconnaissance beyond the designated search grids, extending into less trafficked areas of Cherokee National Forest. The justification cited Mercer's last known phone ping, which originated from a tower farther west than his recorded trail position. That discrepancy 20 miles off the expected route was never resolved in public reports. Meanwhile, accounts began circulating from other hikers. A woman traveling with her husband recalled hearing a man shouting late at night on May 16th near Straight Branch. They dismissed it at the time as a quarrel between campers, but later wondered if it had been a call for help. Another hiker described stumbling upon stacked stones, 3 high, every few hundred yards, along an unofficial spur path. He assumed they were markers left by locals, until he heard of Mercer's disappearance and realized the cairns matched ranger photographs from the search logs. By midsummer, theories multiplied. Local newspapers speculated about foul play. Perhaps Mercer had crossed paths with poachers or squatters. Others leaned on the familiar wilderness explanation: disorientation, a fall, an unmarked grave in the undergrowth. But fragments from the official file hinted at anomalies. A ranger's memo mentioned animal sign inconsistent with bear or deer near a streambed where canine units had briefly alerted. No photographs accompanied the note. The log entry was marked "no further action." The family, unsatisfied, began gathering testimony on their own. Mercer's brother conducted interviews with hikers in trail towns, piecing together stories of someone matching his appearance, moving fast, avoiding shelters, and refusing to speak to others. A store clerk in Shady Valley recalled a man buying water bottles with crumpled bills, his clothes wet and muddy. The date matched May 16th. The account was never added to the official record. By autumn, with no body recovered and no material evidence beyond rumor and cairns, the case was formally classified as inactive. To the public, it was another tragedy on a dangerous trail. But among those who searched, the unease deepened. One veteran volunteer later said in a taped interview, "We'd find gaps like someone was deliberately moving off trail but staying close enough to be seen, and those cairns, they weren't guides, they were warnings, or maybe something else entirely." The trail had closed over with the passing of seasons, but the sense of absence remained. Mercer was gone, leaving no clear trace of what happened. Only scattered testimonies, strange markers in the woods, and a growing suspicion that the official explanation, exposure, accident, misadventure, was never enough to account for the silence that followed him into the mountains. By the following spring, the disappearance had hardened into a mystery that local authorities seemed eager to close, but fragments continued to surface, often in ways that resisted tidy explanation. Independent investigators, some retired law enforcement, and others drawn by the strangeness of the case, began requesting access to search files. What they uncovered only deepened the unease. One set of radio dispatch transcripts, obtained through a Freedom of Information request, recorded an exchange between search teams on May 22, 2011. A ground unit reported finding fresh boot impressions near Low Gap. The impressions matched military-issue boots in size and tread, consistent with Mercer's known gear. The prints, however, ended abruptly at a creek bed with no continuation on the opposite bank. Possible washout, the log notes, but investigators later pointed out that the soil on the far side was dry and undisturbed, as though no one had crossed. A parallel thread emerged in the form of local folklore. Residents of Damascus and Shady Valley spoke quietly of the Watcher of the Ridges, an old Appalachian tale about a presence that moved silently along tree lines, always parallel to travelers. Oral histories describe stacked stones as its calling card. Some accounts claim it was a hunter's spirit, others a nameless entity that marked those who entered certain parts of the forest. Most rangers dismissed these as campfire stories, but the cairns cataloged in Mercer's file mirrored those described in the folklore. The coincidence was never addressed in official summaries. More troubling were the journal fragments recovered years later, though whispers of their contents had begun circulating even before the official release. Mercer's family spoke of unsettling notes in his letters home, written weeks before his hike, describing how he had trouble sleeping, convinced someone was tailing him during training exercises on base. The letters were never produced in court or public hearings, but their existence hinted at a continuity between his military past and his final days on the trail. By mid-2012, pressure from the family led to a limited FBI re-examination. Agents interviewed locals who had reported strange noises in the woods that may, a low hum, metallic clicks, and once, a long, drawn-out whistle. Audio technicians reviewed dispatch recordings and noted anomalies in the background static, faint patterns resembling Morse code. The sounds were ultimately logged as interference, but the notes remained in the case file, redacted in later releases. Forensic specialists also revisited the canine alerts near the stream bed. Archived notes indicated that dogs had fixated on a cluster of rocks but refused to advance, behavior handlers described as unusual. Soil samples taken from the site showed elevated traces of manganese and iron, inconsistent with surrounding geology. The report recommended further geological survey. No such survey was ever conducted. As months turned into years, the case slipped further from the public eye. Yet among those who had walked the trail during that season, stories persisted. Hikers described encountering warning signs carved crudely into bark arrows, symbols, slashes that did not match normal trail markings. One ranger privately admitted that these carvings appeared in areas where Mercer was last believed to have traveled. Official files listed them only as vandalism. This period marked the first fracture between the official narrative and accident, a fall, a body never recovered, and the growing body of circumstantial evidence that suggested something else. Witness testimony, dispatch anomalies, folklore, and forensic oddities converged into a pattern too complex to dismiss outright. For Mercer's family, it was a turning point. The conviction that what had happened on the Appalachian Trail was not misadventure, but a hidden story, one that someone, somewhere, did not want told. By the 5th year of Mercer's absence, the case had entered the realm of whispered speculation. The official record remained unchanged, but families, volunteers, and independent investigators continued to push against the silence. In 2016, a group of amateur researchers retraced the original search grids, armed with GPS mapping and drones. What they found unsettled even the hardened rangers who later reviewed the footage. In an overgrown hollow near Holston Mountain, the team captured aerial images of geometric clearings, small patches where underbrush had been cut or flattened into patterns visible only from above. Triangles, concentric circles, and crude arrows pointing north. No official trail crews admitted to making them, and they did not match logging operations. Soil disturbance samples later indicated the markings were at least 5 years old, dating them to the period of Mercer's disappearance. The photographs were quietly submitted to the Park Service, but no follow-up action was taken. That same year, Mercer's brother released a recording he had kept hidden, the distorted voicemail left on May 14th, the last time Daniel's phone connected to a tower. The message, brief and broken, played with static, but certain words rang clear. Not alone. Still moving. Can't stop. Audio engineers brought in by a local news outlet claimed the distortion contained layered background sounds, what they described as pacing footsteps beneath the static. The FBI never authenticated these claims, but the recording was enough to reignite public interest. Then came the most dramatic development. In October 2017, hunters stumbled across Mercer's rucksack, lodged under the roots of a storm-felled oak. Inside, protected by wax-sealed bags, lay his journal. The condition of the pack suggested deliberate concealment rather than accidental loss, straps intact, items carefully stowed. Its discovery location was more than 12 miles off his expected route. Investigators released only selected pages to the family, but leaks from within the forensic team described passages far more disturbing than what was publicly acknowledged. Among the known entries, Mercer writing of shadows pacing ridgelines at night, and cairns reappearing after being kicked down. He described waking to the sound of breathing outside the tent, rhythmic, close, but retreating when I held my knife. On May 15th, his final entry. I turned back today. It follows without sound. I will not reach the road. Whoever finds this, do not follow my trail. The journal pages bore smears of soil rich in iron and manganese, consistent with the anomalous site where search dogs had first alerted years earlier. Forensic labs confirmed his handwriting, but analysis of the soil samples was redacted from the final report. When pressed by the family, the FBI cited classified methodology. The Park Service closed the renewed investigation quickly, stating, Journal provides no actionable leads. Subject remains missing. But independent investigators argued the notebook itself was evidence proof Mercer had been conscious, aware, and documenting something deliberate in his final hours. From that point onward, Mercer's disappearance was no longer treated as an unsolved accident. It became a contested narrative. The government's insistence on an unresolved case versus a growing body of irregularities, journal entries, recordings, aerial images, folklore. That suggested something else had pursued him through the mountains. For his family, the release of the journal was both a confirmation and a torment. They had his words, but not his body. They had a voice, but no answer. And behind every blacked-out page, every redacted report, they sensed a withheld truth, one that hinted at forces moving in the forest, forces no official summary dared to acknowledge. The release of Mercer's journal set in motion a series of independent inquiries that began to peel back layers of the official silence. In early 2018, a collective of former park rangers, retired law enforcement officers, and academic researchers launched what they called the Trail Anomaly Project. Their goal was not to solve the case outright, but to document inconsistencies and compare Mercer's disappearance with other unresolved incidents along the Appalachian corridor. What they uncovered suggested disturbing patterns. Archived incident logs from as far back as the 1970s revealed clusters of disappearances within a 50-mile radius of where Mercer vanished. Most were written off as falls, drownings, or intentional runaways, yet the details echoed Mercer's file. Hikers leaving behind no trace, search dogs alerting but refusing to advance, reports of cairns or unusual stone arrangements in remote areas. In a 1984 case, a college student was last seen near Holston Mountain. His friends described him as convinced someone was tracking them. His body was never recovered. The Trail Anomaly Project also obtained fragments of an internal FBI memo through a Freedom of Information request. Dated 2012, it referenced anomalous ground disturbances consistent with deliberate concealment near one of the search sites. The memo was heavily redacted, but a surviving line noted, "Pattern recurrence observed in at least 4 prior cases." No such connection had ever been publicly acknowledged. At the same time, independent forensic experts re-examined Mercer's pack. Photographs leaked from the lab showed not only the journal but also a knife with a broken tip, as though it had been driven into something solid. The blade bore traces of residue, neither metallic nor animal, that analysts could not classify. The FBI's final report listed the knife as damaged, inconclusive. Yet one internal email, later published by a whistleblower, suggested the residue contained organic elements inconsistent with local fauna. Witness testimony continued to filter in. A retired fire lookout claimed to have seen strange lights above the ridges in May 2011, bluish-white orbs that moved silently and faded when approached. 2 hunters, interviewed in 2018, described stumbling upon fresh boot tracks deep in the forest boots that seemed to circle back on themselves repeatedly, as though the wearer was pacing in confusion. They could not explain why the prints ended abruptly at a patch of untouched ground. By now, Mercer's case had evolved from a missing hiker investigation into a story of suppression. Journalists noted how many requests for records were denied or returned with blank pages. Families of other missing hikers reported similar treatment. Even the Park Service, usually transparent about accidents, kept an unusual distance. When pressed in a televised interview, a spokesperson admitted, "Certain findings remain under federal review." No clarification followed. The psychological toll on Mercer's family was evident. His brother, once the main voice demanding answers, began keeping his own archive of interviews, photographs, and maps. In one recording, he speaks candidly, "The more we push, the more walls go up. Either they know something they won't admit, or they don't want to admit they don't know at all." His frustration mirrored that of many who tried to navigate the murky border between fact, rumor, and omission. Meanwhile, fragments of Mercer's journal continued to circulate. Pages previously withheld surfaced through leaks, describing a figure in the tree line, never closer than 50 yards, always watching. He noted the sound of rocks clacking together at night, and once, a shape crouched near the cairns at dawn, gone when I blinked. These passages, though unverifiable, matched long-standing local legends of watchers in the ridges. By late 2018, the Trail Anomaly Project published a report compiling these patterns. Their conclusion was cautious, but chilling. Mercer's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a recurring phenomenon, one that official agencies seemed unwilling to confront. The report ended with a line that echoed Mercer's final words: "If something follows, it has followed others before." The 6th year since Mercer vanished closed not with answers, but with a widening gap between what was known, what was suspected, and what was being deliberately withheld. In that silence, the sense of something unresolved and perhaps unresolvable grew heavier, pressing on anyone who tried to step into the shadows he left behind. By the time 2019 arrived, the Mercer case had fractured into two competing narratives: the official stance of an unresolved disappearance with no evidence of foul play, and the growing dossier of anomalies compiled by independent investigators, family members, and journalists unwilling to let the silence stand. What made this phase different was how much of the story began leaking into public consciousness, not through official statements, but through fragments, photographs, testimonies, and heavily redacted documents slipped out of archives. One of the most unsettling developments came from a Freedom of Information release requested by a small Virginia newspaper. Buried within thousands of pages was a search team after action report dated May 23, 2011. In it, a ranger described hearing a series of knocks, metallic in tone, repeating in threes, during a night bivouac near Holston Mountain. The report notes the sound stopped whenever the team attempted to move toward them. Officially, the noises were attributed to distant logging activity, but when cross-checked, no logging crews were operating within 40 miles of that sector at the time. That same year, forensic reanalysis of Mercer's journal revealed something else previously withheld: faint impressions on the pages, consistent with writing that had been pressed hard enough to leave marks, but not ink. When enhanced under laboratory lighting, these indentations formed incomplete phrases. Among them were the words, "Don't look back," "Still pacing," and a fragmented line, "Can hear it breathing." Investigators refused to confirm whether these impressions were Mercer's, but handwriting analysts insisted the style matched his known notes. Civilians also contributed to the puzzle. A long-distance hiker reported finding, in 2014, an abandoned fire ring deep off-trail near the same grid where Mercer disappeared. The hiker claimed the ring contained charred fragments of wax-sealed paper, the edges still legible with block letters that appeared to be coordinates. The man, unnerved, left the site untouched. When he returned weeks later with friends, the ring was gone, stone circle dismantled, ash removed, the forest floor scrubbed bare. He came forward only years later, after reading about the journal's discovery. His testimony was entered into the Trail Anomaly Project's archive, never acknowledged by the Park Service. Psychological impact now loomed as part of the narrative. Rangers who had worked the original search described long-lasting unease. One man, interviewed anonymously, said, "It wasn't just losing a hiker. It was the sense we weren't the only ones moving out there. I felt observed every minute." Such statements were brushed aside by officials, but preserved in oral history projects documenting the case. Meanwhile, Mercer's family continued pressing for transparency. His brother staged a quiet protest outside the regional FBI office in Roanoke, holding a sign that read simply, "Where are the missing pages?" He claimed entire sections of Daniel's journal had been withheld, including sketches of cairn formations and crude drawings of figures in tree lines. Whether these pages existed was never officially confirmed, though references to illustrations appear in an internal catalog list of the recovered notebook. International attention briefly flickered on the case when a British documentary crew visited Damascus in 2019, interviewing locals about Appalachian folklore. Several elderly residents spoke of lights on the ridges and stone markers that walk in the night. The crew's footage, when broadcast months later, juxtaposed these folk accounts with Mercer's notes, suggesting overlap between legend and lived experience. American officials dismissed the program as sensationalism, but for many, it underscored how quickly folklore and investigation were intertwining. As 2019 closed, Operation Grafe, what investigators quietly called the pattern file of Mercer and others, was no closer to official resolution. Instead, it revealed a system straining under withheld truths, psychological scars among those who searched, and a family haunted by words they could read but not reconcile. Resistance had given way to adaptation, but adaptation now meant adjusting to the possibility that the Appalachian woods contained forces, human, natural, or otherwise, that resisted explanation altogether. It was the year when Mercer's disappearance stopped being a closed case file and became something else. A question etched into both official silence and whispered folklore, heavy enough to make even seasoned investigators admit, if only off record, that they were no longer sure what they were chasing. By the beginning of 2020, the Mercer case entered what many investigators quietly described as the moment of fracture, the point where the weight of evidence, rumor, and suppressed detail pushed the story into a new, more dangerous territory. It was no longer just about a missing veteran. It was about what his journal, the field reports, and the silences between official statements seemed to suggest. The turning point came when fragments of withheld material began surfacing through leaks that authorities could not fully contain. The first break came from an anonymous source within a regional lab. A series of photographs, later circulated online, appeared to show pages of Mercer's journal that had never been released to the family. These pages contained crude sketches, jagged ridgelines, cairns stacked 4 and 5 stones high, and shapes in the tree line rendered as silhouettes. One drawing in particular showed a figure crouched low, elongated arms extending toward the ground. In the margin, Mercer had scrawled, "Not a man, watching from slope." Analysts who studied the images could not determine whether they were authentic, but handwriting comparisons aligned with known samples of Mercer's writing. The FBI declined comment. Another turning point emerged from a retired ranger's testimony, given under the condition his name remained sealed until after his death. In his taped statement, he described being part of a second, unrecorded sweep of the Holston Mountains sector days after the official search was called off. His team, he claimed, was ordered to investigate disturbances reported by aerial reconnaissance irregular heat signatures that did not match wildlife. He recalled approaching a clearing where cairns were arranged in precise geometric lines, like runways. The formation was dismantled the following morning by unknown personnel, and his report was never entered into the file. Public unease spiked again when journalists uncovered a series of sealed court records relating to Mercer's disappearance. The documents referenced classified methodologies used in analyzing soil and organic residue from Mercer's knife, with explicit instructions to block release under national security exemptions. No explanation was given as to why a hiker's missing person case warranted such protection. For Mercer's family, this was the most damning sign yet that something beyond wilderness hazards was being concealed. At the same time, local accounts fed into the escalating tension. In early 2020, 2 campers reported being awoken at night by the sound of stones being knocked together near the old Backbone Rock Tunnel. When they shone flashlights, they saw no one, but the cairns around their site had shifted by morning rocks stacked differently than before. They left the trail immediately, shaken. Their report was dismissed as a prank, yet investigators noticed the similarity to sounds described in Mercer's journal. The broader psychological impact reached new levels. Hikers on the Appalachian Trail began trading stories of being shadowed in certain sectors, even when no one was visible. Online forums chronicled dozens of similar experiences, often involving cairns that seemed to appear overnight. The Mercer case, once a personal tragedy, now became a focal point for a much wider anxiety. That the trail itself was host to something unrecorded, something that followed without being seen. Within agencies, the strain showed. A leaked memo from a Park Service meeting noted the need to mitigate folklore proliferation. Another from the FBI urged caution in responding to media inquiries, stating, "Narrative containment remains priority." These phrases, sterile on paper, revealed that officials were less concerned with solving the case than with managing how it was perceived. The turning point of 2020 made the silence around Mercer's disappearance louder than ever. His words, "It does not stop following," echoed not only in his journal but in the experiences of others who walked those ridges. Each withheld page, each redacted report, each unexplained testimony drew the story further from the realm of accident and closer to the unknown. By this stage, the question was no longer simply, what happened to Daniel Mercer? It was whether the forces moving in those mountains were natural, human, or something else entirely, and why every official channel seemed determined to keep that answer sealed. As 2021 unfolded, the Mercer case settled into its most unsettling phase, the aftermath, where unanswered questions hardened into fractures between what was known, what was withheld, and what was deliberately erased. The official record remained stagnant, yet new fragments surfaced from unexpected corners, widening the gulf between narrative and evidence. The FBI formally closed their file in early spring, citing exhaustive investigation, no further leads. But inside the closure notice, buried in annex references, was mention of ongoing environmental monitoring in subject sector. To outsiders, the phrase was meaningless. To researchers who had followed the case, it hinted that surveillance in the Holston Mountain corridor had never stopped. Independent investigators filed Freedom of Information requests demanding clarification. Every request was returned stamped, "Denied national security exemption." Meanwhile, Mercer's family pushed their own inquiries. His brother obtained, through informal contacts, several pages from an uncirculated Rangers field log. Dated May 21, 2011, the entry described a clearing where underbrush pressed flat in circular patterns, radius approx. 12 feet, no signs of wildlife bedding. The ranger noted hearing a low, rhythmic hum that ceased abruptly when the team entered the area. The page ended with the phrase, "Recommend follow-up, possible unauthorized equipment operation." It was never included in public summaries. Civilian accounts also complicated the aftermath. In June 2021, a pair of hikers reported finding what they believed to be Mercer's boot military issue, degraded, lodged in a creek bed. When they returned the following day with rangers, the boot was gone. Photographs they had taken showed worn leather, partly torn laces, and faint stenciling consistent with military surplus. Rangers dismissed it as coincidental, noting that surplus gear was common in the region. Yet for the family, it was another piece of evidence swallowed by silence. The Trail Anomaly Project released their second report that year, compiling testimonies, leaked logs, and environmental data. They documented electromagnetic anomalies recorded by amateur radio operators along the trail, spikes that coincided with both the period of Mercer's disappearance and later reports of strange lights. They also highlighted missing segments in dispatch radio archives, entire 10-minute gaps on May 18, 2011, labeled as corrupted. When cross-referenced with ground team positions, those gaps coincided with the zone where K-9 units had once refused to advance. Psychological impact deepened in the aftermath. Rangers who had been involved in the search reported nightmares, insomnia, and an enduring sense of unease. One former team member admitted in a 2021 interview, "I kept hearing those knocks, even years later, in the woods, on night patrols. 3 in a row, always 3. His account was dismissed as stress-related trauma, but others who served alongside him quietly confirmed similar experiences. Public speculation reached fever pitch. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected the case, drawing connections to older Appalachian disappearances and Cherokee legends of watchers in the ridges. The Mercer family, exhausted, withdrew from most media attention. Yet in one rare statement, his brother said, "They want us to believe Daniel simply slipped and vanished, but slips don't write journals, accidents don't leave cairns. Someone or something was with him." By late 2021, the Mercer case had become less about finding him and more about confronting the vacuum left behind. The trail where he vanished was reclaimed by moss, storms, and silence. The cairns were gone, dismantled or scattered, though hikers still whispered of finding fresh stacks in remote hollows. The aftermath left no closure, only fragments, leaks, and stories too consistent to ignore, yet too fragile to prove. The withdrawal from official channels meant the truth, whatever it was, slipped further into the shadows. In the silence, the question shifted. Not just where Daniel Mercer went, but what presence had walked those ridges with him, and why its trace seemed to vanish whenever light was cast upon it. More than a decade after Daniel Mercer stepped onto the Appalachian Trail, his disappearance remains suspended between file closures and whispered speculation. The legacy of his case is not a single narrative, but a fracture and uneasy blend of official silence, leaked fragments, and folklore that refuses to fade. What lingers is not the certainty of accident or crime, but the weight of something that resists classification. A story that reshaped how hikers, rangers, and even investigators think about those ridges. Within official archives, the Mercer file is slim, stamped inactive, its most revealing attachments withheld under the banner of national security. Yet outside those walls, a counter-archive has formed. Independent reports, photographs of cairns, radio logs with unexplained gaps, and testimonies of those who felt watched on the same trails. Together, they construct a parallel record, one that refuses to align with the sanitized accident theory. In this record, Mercer's words, "It does not stop following," become less a personal fear and more a thread woven through decades of disappearances, strange disturbances, and anomalies noted then quietly erased. The cultural impact has been striking. For hikers, Mercer's story is now a cautionary tale, told in shelters in small trail towns. Some carry charms or carve their initials into trees as markers, superstitions born from fear of being erased without trace. For investigators, the case has become a study in how unconventional events are handled through redaction, silence, and the reframing of anomalies as routine. For Mercer's family, it remains an open wound, deepened by the knowledge that answers exist in sealed pages and withheld evidence. Psychologists studying the case point to the corrosive effect of secrecy itself. When truth is denied, speculation fills the void. Folklore mutates into something sharper, blending with facts until neither can be separated. The Watcher of the Ridges, once a fireside legend, now carries the weight of corroborating details. Cairns documented, noises logged, journal entries authenticated. Whether one believes in the presence or not, its image has become inseparable from the geography where Mercer vanished. Historians of military life note another legacy: the vulnerability of veterans returning from conflict. Mercer, trained to observe and survive, entered the forest with discipline. His journal reads less like paranoia and more like field notes. The fact that his disappearance remains unresolved suggests less a personal failure than a confrontation with something his training could not counter. This interpretation has fueled debates about how societies treat the unexplained when it intersects with those who served. In popular culture, the story has become material for documentaries, books, and whispered retellings online. Yet, unlike many mysteries, Mercer's case resists resolution. Every time a new document surfaces, it raises further questions. Why were entire sections of dispatch recordings corrupted? Why were stone formations dismantled before they could be studied? Why does a wilderness accident merit national security exemptions? The absence of answers becomes its own evidence, pointing to forces, bureaucratic or otherwise, that prefer the story remain unfinished. The legacy of Daniel Mercer's disappearance is therefore twofold. It is a tragedy for a family denied closure, and it is a case study in how mysteries linger when truth is redacted. It unsettles hikers who walk those same paths, and it haunts investigators who still recall the feeling of being watched. It challenges the boundary between folklore and fact, forcing us to consider whether some stories endure precisely because they carry fragments of reality. And so the file stays open in the public imagination, even if closed in the archives. Mercer's last words, scrawled in damp pages and preserved against the elements, outlive the silence of official reports. It does not stop following. Whether those words describe paranoia, human threat, or something beyond our frameworks, they leave us with a question that echoes across the ridges. What really happened out there? And why has no one dared to tell it in full?